The night before the fire, Belle Gunness bought her children cake and a toy train. She also purchased a large quantity of fuel. That same afternoon, she had updated her will, telling her attorney she feared for her life. She came home, fed her children dinner, and let them play with their new toy until bedtime. At 4 a.m, the farmhouse on McClung Road was gone. 4 people were found in the ruins. A man who had been threatening Belle for months was arrested before noon. The case looked settled. It was not settled, because the question investigators should have been asking was not who started that fire. It was how many people had already lost their lives on this property before anyone thought to look at the soil beneath the hog pen. The answer to that question starts 20 years earlier, and it starts in Norway. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a place when something has gone wrong inside it for a long time. The farm on McClung Road in LaPorte, Indiana, had that kind of quiet. It sat on 42 acres at the edge of town, well-kept, productive, surrounded by fields that looked like every other field in that part of Indiana. The woman who ran it was a Norwegian immigrant named Belle Gunness. She was a widow. She had 3 children. She worked the land herself and ran her household with an efficiency that her neighbors respected. Nobody looked at that farm and saw anything wrong. That is the first thing you need to understand about this story. Everything that happened there happened because it looked completely ordinary from every angle anyone thought to look from. The neighbors who noticed men arriving with luggage and not being seen again assumed those men had simply moved on. The insurance companies that paid out claim after claim across 2 decades never compared their individual records with each other. The local sheriff, who received complaints about a fired farmhand, focused on the farmhand. Nobody ever stood back far enough to see the full picture until the full picture was already buried in the ground. By the time anyone dug it up, the farm on McClung Road had been operating as a hidden crime scene for nearly 20 years, and the woman who ran it had almost certainly already left. Belle Gunness was born Brynhild Paulsdatter in Selbu, Norway in 1859. She grew up in a tenant farming family that worked land owned by someone else and would never own it themselves. Her father was a stonemason. Her mother raised several children on very little. The lesson Belle took from that childhood was not one about resilience or community or faith. It was a very specific lesson about money, that the people who had it lived differently than the people who did not, and that she intended to have it. She emigrated to Chicago in 1881 at the age of 21, having saved for years to afford the crossing. She changed her name to Belle when she arrived. She found work as a domestic servant and later in a butcher's shop, physical labor that suited her. She was close to 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and physically powerful in a way that people noticed and remembered. She was also, by the accounts of those who knew her, unusually focused. Her sister Nellie, who had settled in Chicago before her, later said in interviews that money was the only thing Belle truly cared about, and that she had been that way her entire life. In 1884, Belle married a Norwegian immigrant named Mads Sorensen. They opened a small shop together. The shop burned down and was insured. Their home burned down and was insured. 2 children in the household died and were insured. Then, in 1900, on the one day of the year when 2 overlapping life insurance policies on Mads Sorensen were simultaneously active, Mads came home with a headache and didn't survive the evening. The first doctor to examine the body noted symptoms consistent with a toxic substance. The family doctor attributed the cause to a heart condition he had been treating. His assessment was accepted. Belle collected $5,000, which in today's money equals roughly $187,000. Mad Sorensen's family accused her directly. Nothing came of it. Belle moved to Indiana. Belle arrived in LaPorte in 1901 and bought the farm on McClung Road with the money she had collected in Chicago. She set herself up in the community with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She worked the land, raised her children, attended church, and presented herself to her neighbors as exactly what they expected to see. A hard-working immigrant widow rebuilding her life through honest effort. LaPorte was a small town where people noticed things and talked about them, but Belle gave them nothing worth talking about. She was respectable. She was self-sufficient. She minded her own business and ran a tight property. In a community like that, at that time, those qualities were enough to earn a person the benefit of every doubt. Within a year of arriving, she had met Peter Gunness, a local butcher and recent widower with 2 young daughters. They married in April 1902. The marriage lasted 8 months. Peter's infant daughter from his first marriage passed away not long after the wedding, while in Belle's care. The circumstances were not formally investigated. Then in December 1902, Peter himself was gone. Belle told investigators that a heavy meat grinder had fallen from a shelf in the kitchen and caused a fatal injury. The coroner examined the body, described the circumstances as unusual, and noted that the injury did not quite match the explanation Belle had given. But there was no direct evidence contradicting her account, no witnesses, and no physical proof of anything other than what she described. The death was ruled accidental. Belle collected the insurance policy and continued running the farm. Peter's brother traveled to LaPorte shortly after the death, spent time at the farm, spoke with neighbors, and came away unconvinced by what he had heard. He could not prove anything, but he could act on what he believed, and he did. He removed Peter's surviving 5-year-old daughter, Swanhild, from the farm and moved her to Wisconsin to live with him. He never publicly stated what he suspected. He simply took the child and left. Swanhild Gunness was the only child in Belle's care known to have survived. Belle's adopted daughter, Jenny Olson, was 14 years old at the time of Peter's death. She told a classmate at school that she had witnessed her mother was responsible for what happened to his stepfather, and that she was afraid of what Belle might do if she found out Jenny had spoken. When the coroner's inquest questioned Jenny directly, she either denied having made the statement or said her classmate had misunderstood her. The inquest did not pursue the matter further. 2 years passed. Then, in 1906, Jenny stopped appearing around the farm. Belle told neighbors she had enrolled Jenny at a finishing school for young women in Los Angeles. She was doing wonderfully and would be home to visit when she had the chance. Neighbors accepted the explanation. Nobody wrote to the school to verify it. Nobody asked Belle for a specific address or a way to reach Jenny directly. She was a teenager who had been sent away to study, and that was the end of it as far as LaPorte was concerned. Jenny Olson's remains were recovered from the soil near the hog pen in May 1908. She had never left the farm. Starting in 1905, Belle placed personal advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest. The text read as follows: "Comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided with view to joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. Triflers need not apply." The advertisement was a filter, not a romantic appeal. It identified the kind of man Belle wanted: someone with savings, someone willing to travel, someone willing to commit. The letters she sent in response were entirely different in tone. They were warm, personal, and carefully written to make each man feel that she had found something in him specifically. She corresponded with multiple men at once, building each relationship over weeks or months before inviting the man to visit. When she extended that invitation, she always included the same instruction: bring your savings, come prepared to invest in our future together, and keep it between us for now, until you arrive and we can make proper plans. That last part, the secrecy, was the mechanism that made everything else possible. A man who told no one where he was going could disappear without anyone knowing where to start looking. The men who answered Belle's advertisement were not reckless. They were not naive in any unusual way. They were working people who had crossed an ocean looking for something better and had spent years building modest security in a new country. They were looking for a partner, a home, a life that felt like it was finally going somewhere worth going. Belle understood that desire completely because she had come from the same background they had. She knew exactly what it felt like to want stability and not have it, and she used that understanding to reach them in precisely the right way. Ole Budsberg from Wisconsin withdrew his life savings and traveled to LaPorte in 1907. His sons wrote to Belle asking about him. She first denied ever meeting him, then later said he had left suddenly for another city. John Moe from Minnesota came in 1906 with over $1,000. Neighbors saw him at the farm. He vanished. Henry Gerholt wrote home after arriving, saying he liked what he saw and asked his family to send seed potatoes because he was planning to stay and put in a garden. His family wrote back. Henry had already stopped writing. When they eventually reached Belle, she told them he had gone to Chicago with horse traders. The seed potatoes are the detail that stays with you. A man arrived at a farm in Indiana, looked around, believed completely in the future he thought he was walking into, and wrote home asking for seed potatoes because he was thinking about next season's garden. He had no idea. Andrew Helglian from South Dakota came in January 1908 after 18 months of correspondence. He withdrew $2,800 from his bank before leaving. He told almost no one where he was going. He sent one letter home after arriving, saying everything was fine. Then silence. After the excavation of the farm in 1908, investigators found inside the farmhouse a collection of men's belongings: watches, wallets, clothing, personal effects that a man leaving voluntarily would have taken with him. None of them had been taken anywhere. They sat in that house belonging to men whose families were still writing letters and getting no reply. The farm's longtime farmhand later told investigators that a new man arrived with a trunk almost every week during Belle's years placing advertisements. None of those men were ever seen leaving. He had not, until everything came out in 1908, understood what that meant. The farmhouse on McClung Road burned in the early hours of April 28, 1908. The fire moved fast. By the time neighbors arrived and a fire crew responded, the structure was already past saving. In the basement, investigators found 4 individuals. 3 were Belle's children. The 4th was an adult woman. There was one immediate problem. Belle was known to stand close to 6 feet tall and weigh well over 200 pounds. The woman in the basement was several inches shorter and considerably lighter. And her remains were incomplete. A set of dental bridges was eventually recovered from the debris and identified by Belle's dentist as hers. Based on this, the coroner declared Belle Gunness deceased, but the bridges had been found separately from the body, in an unusual location within the ruins, and the physical inconsistency between Belle's known measurements and the woman in the basement remained unexplained. Meanwhile, a fired farm hand named Ray Lamphere, who had been making public threats against Belle for months and had been arrested for trespassing on the property, was arrested before noon that same day. The case looked settled. It was 1 week from being completely upended. On May 4th, 1 week after the fire, Asil Helgelien arrived in LaPorte from South Dakota. He had been writing to Belle for months asking about his brother Andrew. Her replies had become more evasive with each exchange. He did not believe them. He came to find answers himself. Walking the property with the farm hand Joe Maxon, Asil noticed soft depressions in the soil near the hog pen. He asked if anyone had been digging there. Maxon said Belle had mentioned burying trash in that area. Asil said to dig it up anyway. Beneath a shallow layer of soil, they found a burlap sack. Inside the sack were remains altered to hinder identification. Asil Helgelien looked at what remained and recognized his brother. The officers present looked out across the surrounding grounds and saw that the depressions were not limited to one spot. They spread across the property. They sent for more workers and started digging. By the end of the first day, evidence of 5 buried individuals had been recovered, including Andrew Helgelien and Jenny Olson, who had supposedly been living at a school in California for 2 years. By the end of the second day, 6 more had been found. The farm drew 20,000 visitors a day at the height of the coverage. Reporters filed dispatches that ran on front pages across the country. LaPorte, Indiana, became the most talked about address in America. Ray Lamphere stood trial in November 1908. The prosecution presented him as a jealous, volatile former employee who had finally acted on his threats. The defense argued that if Belle had staged the entire event herself, the charges against Lamphere had no logical foundation. The jury returned a divided verdict. Lamphere was found responsible for causing the fire, but not for the deaths. He was sentenced to 20 years. He died of tuberculosis in December 1909, having served approximately 1 year. Before his death, Lamphere requested a visit from Reverend Edwin Schell and made a statement. Schell wrote it down, had Lamphere sign it, and sealed it. After Lamphere died, Schell shared the contents with a Chicago journalist. The statement described a deliberate operation running on that farm for years. Lamphere said he had discovered what Belle was doing by accident during repair work on the property. He said he had helped her with concealment, but was not involved in any of the deaths connected to the case. He also said Belle had not been in the farmhouse when the fire started. She had arranged the scene, arranged the narrative pointing to him as the suspect, and had left the property before the fire began. Reported sightings of Belle arrived for years from across the country. In 1931, a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles for causing the death of a Norwegian immigrant man for financial gain. She was approximately the right age, bore a physical resemblance to Belle in available photographs, had no documented personal history prior to 1908, and carried a photograph of 3 children who resembled Belle's known children. Esther Carlson died in 1931 while awaiting trial before her identity could be formally investigated. In 2007, forensic researchers exhumed the remains in Belle's grave and found the skeletal height consistent with Belle's known measurements, considerably taller than the original coroner had estimated. DNA samples from both the remains and a letter Belle had written were too degraded for a usable result. The official record still states she died on April 28, 1908. Whether that is true, no one knows with certainty. What this case leaves behind is not just a record of what Belle Gunness did. It is a record of how long the world around her let it continue. Every institution that should have caught the pattern looked only at individual pieces and found individual explanations. The insurance companies, the local authorities, the neighbors, even the families of missing men across several states, none of them were sharing what they knew with each other. The pattern was only visible when everything was laid out in one place at one time. Nobody did that until a brother traveled to LaPorte and asked a farmhand where the holes had been dug. That is the part of this story that does not let go. Not the scale of what happened on that farm, but the knowledge that it was happening in plain sight, inside a community, for nearly 2 decades, and the one thing that finally stopped it was one person refusing to accept a vague answer. That is worth remembering, long after everything else fades. This case lasted 20 years because no one was looking at all of it at once, only at individual pieces that each had a reasonable explanation on their own. If this story changed the way you think about how something like this stays hidden, share this video so more people can see the full picture. These are exactly the kinds of cases that deserve a wider audience. Share it with someone who needs to hear it.